So thank you very much. Delighted to be here. It's my first time in Sheffield, and I am really impressed. The range of work has been astounding. It maps perfectly onto what I'm going to talk about today. I'd like to thank the organizers, Dan in particular, and I'm going to reveal something personal. Yeah, it's Dan's birthday. Give the man a hand. Come on. If you need to age, and we all do, this is the place to do it. Entering a birthday as a husk. Yeah, so I'm going to indeed talk a lot about algorithmic storytelling today. There are a lot of new tools. There are a lot of new possibilities. And of course, there are huge dangers. And one of the things, why it's important that we, the documentary community, seize this stuff and work with it. And this goes back to what some of Dan's opening comments. I think we're sort of the critical R&D division when it comes to culture. New technologies are always emerging, and there's people happy to exploit those for whatever reasons. Our job is to reappropriate them, to take them and put them to other uses, to reveal truths about the world, to tell comfortable but more often uncomfortable tales. What I'm going to focus on today is another aspect of it, one we've taken for granted with the camera, but we need to really think about with new media, and that is there's a critical interrogation of the potentials of media, their abilities to present and to represent. And we've got to take that apart and show how that works. We have to hold the mirror up to the new technologies, show their critical capacities and possibilities, but also show their failings and their dangers. So that is, it's not doing the social change work is profoundly central to what we do. That's certainly what we do in our lab. But there's another part that's about revealing the instruments that we work with, generating a critical discourse about those instruments and their workings. And that's kind of what I'll talk a little bit about today. The lab, we're well positioned at MIT, which is largely, it skews scientifically and technologically. Our lab is based in the humanities, arts, and social sciences, and so we're in a really good position to sort of look at emerging technologies and start to generate the kind of critiques that I'll talk about today. And what we do at the lab is basically put together documentary makers with those new tool sets, shake wildly, and see what comes of it. So I think I have to do the clicking, which I will gladly do. Oops. Yeah, got it. Okay. So I start with this image, and I don't know how many of you have read Through the Looking Glass. How many have, by the way? Okay. So this image, the way this narrative is framed, actually speaks directly to, I think, one of the primary uses of algorithms in storytelling today. And you could argue, algorithms in social networks today, which is basically, it's kind of a reflection of us. Some of us become, some elements of our behaviors, our attitudes, our past actions become the drivers of a narrative. And when Alice goes through that looking glass, the world that's there is not the world she knows from before she went through the glass, but everything is kind of related to it. It's kind of a reading of that world, a perverse and twisted reading, depending on how you read Carol. But the point is, it's a mirror of a kind. But by going through that mirror to the other side, strange things start to happen. So we'll come back to this, and I'll unpack the metaphor a little more. But all to say, algorithms are fairly pervasive in our media systems today, social media, storytelling, but even the logics of what you see and what you don't see are driven by them. They're in our production pipelines. Anyone that's doing anything digital, any color correction work or whatever, is straddled with algorithms out there doing the work. They're pervasive. And I want to talk about a particular kind of them, and it's the kind that has to do with storytelling. How can algorithms enter the space of story creation, and what does that mean for us? Again, there are a lot of spaces where algorithms are currently being deployed to tell stories. This is a particularly interesting one because the author in this case sort of has footnotes along the story telling us what the algorithm suggested and how he and the algorithm interacted. So it's a very visible, it makes the process quite visible. Basically, I'm going to argue that there are three kinds of stories, and everything comes in three, doesn't it? And the first one is really the one that most of us have been brought up on. We've all been brought up on, for sure, but that most of us have been educated on. And whether you've studied literature, whether you've done film studies at university or whatever you've studied, chances are you've come across, in fact, you've been steeped in a notion of story that is all about a text. Hopefully the right text, and if it's not the right text, we need to find the right text, an author, and let's figure out what the author meant. Let's figure out what the text means. Those are the kind of questions. But pretty much you could argue that the Bible in Western culture might be one of the roots of this, a text that a lot of people would go back to and interpret, but it's a very it's a very complicated text, multi-authored, changes all the time. You could argue it's one of the original interactive texts because that interaction is like a glacier. It doesn't seem to move, but in fact it does. Over the millennia, that text has changed profoundly with different communities kind of tweaking it, massaging it. Authorship is a very hard thing to attribute in the case of the Bible. But and we'll talk about this stuff for sure, come the printing press, we get a notion of fixity in the world. The printing press starts to there's some debate about this, but grosso modo, the printing press starts to stabilize the text, and that's the era from about 1450 till today that we inhabit, an era of relatively stable texts. When you buy a book from Amazon or at the bookshop, you expect it to be the same one that other folks are buying. You don't expect a different version of it. The other thing that's born right with the book, literally within 30 years of Gutenberg's printing press, three-point perspective is also born. And three-point perspective is about seeing the world from a point of view. It's about a very clearly defined subject and object relationship. And if you think of both of these technologies and what that represents in terms of the modern era, the modern that begins in the mid 1400s, 1450 or so, and that comes up until today, that modern is built around the self that we have today. That we are number one. We are the unit that understands the world. We're part of groups, but that's all a bit secondary. But it's very different from the Middle Ages. It's arguably very different from some Asian cultures and some African cultures where the self is always in part of a communal entity. Our Western self is transcendent, and we amplify that self through paintings and photographs, always from a point of view. Not like the Middle Ages, where things look quite different. And we amplify that self through publishing, through writing a book and printing out 10,000 copies and spreading them around. So stability matters, and the self matters, the author matters. So with that comes a notion of agency. I can like the book or hate the book, but at least I know who to blame. I can blame the author for writing it. Okay, that's something we know, we've been schooled in, we've been beaten to death about it. It's in our... I did my PhD in film studies. We look at film just like you look at a book, except it's an image track. But we go to the archives, try to find the right version, etc. The experience story seems to be kind of new and is actually kind of old. It's something that the Academy has not really studied. Literature would not really look very closely at this form of story. It's a form of story that's quite old. Carlo Ginzburg argues that this is actually the origin of narrative. He calls it the fanatic tradition, the hunting tradition. A hunter goes out in the world that I walk through kind of blindly. The hunter walks through and sees tracks, sees a bit of fur on a branch, sees a broken branch, sees the depth of a footprint, the age of excrement, whatever. And they come out with a story. This kind of an animal, this size and whatever, walked through here and is going that way and probably going for water, and I'm going to get it. Ginzburg says that this kind of telling, this kind of assemblage of facts in the world into coherence, what hunters have always done, is really the basis for a kind of experiential story, a story that happens as we walk through it. And of course, this could play, but I don't know how to make it play actually from up here. Yeah. You can kill the sound of that field. So Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr. is a brilliant film, and what I didn't show here is the moment when he leaves the audience and jumps into the screen. And in that diegetic world, he doesn't fit, and he's constantly trying to come to terms. He's exploring a space that a creator has made. A filmmaker has made a space, and Keaton, in this very, ontologically challenging way, is like in that space, trying to figure out what's going to happen next and trying to cope with it. So this is kind of an experiential story of a kind, at least as well as film can maybe show it in a linear way. But of course, things like games, a number of genres of games, or in this case, Bear 71, an interactive documentary. Interactive documentaries are a space where there's not a fixed, there's usually, Bear 71 actually kind of has a fixed story, at least a frame, but most of them are kind of open for us to wander and explore. And in that wandering and exploring, we put together our notion of a story. It's kind of a pas de deux between an author who constructs a narrative environment and the user who kind of wanders through that environment, connects the dots, and comes out with a narrative experience. So in this case, there are many possible texts, only one or two of which will be realized by an individual user. I saw Terminal 3 the other day, and I want to go back a couple of times to see if I can explore different branches of that story. Authorship in this case is shared. It's what the user brings to it, but it's what also a kind of another author who's built the environment has done. Point of view and agency are complicated. I bring my agency to bear in what I choose to see and not see, but at the same time, there are constraints in that world that shape what happened. Okay. And we see these narratives a lot. Once you start to think about this as a narrative experience, immersive theater or theme parks, AR and VR certainly, huge potentials in this space, especially thanks to games. This is starting to get a little bit of traction in the academic world. Last decade or so, people have begun to think about, so what are the narrative theories here? How do we think about agency here? What are the domains of the two kinds of authors? They're sort of useful questions to think about. And what's so cool about what happens here in Sheffield or what happens in Amsterdam at the Doc Lab is that what you start to see that it's the doc makers who are taking this up and exploring it and pushing it and testing the limits of that agency, putting users in uncomfortable positions. So we start to ask questions about how the system works, how these narratives work. If I were to compare this to the bus, the tour bus up there is supposed to be like the old school narrative, the book, the movie. You get on, it's a linear experience, you learn a hell of a lot. If you have a good storyteller, it's wonderful. Nothing wrong with it, it's great. But at the same time, if you wander through a city and stop where you want to and look around where you want to, you're always watching street names and street numbers because you want to get home eventually. You can stop in shops. It's a very different kind of narrative experience. Not one that you would get on the bus. And they're different. One isn't better than the other. And in fact, they work best together. And one of the points, I want to make it now clearly, and I hope I remember to say it at the end, these three modes of storytelling, while they exist as individual strategies, are best used together. You know, we've spoken over the last decade or two about transmedia storytelling. In a certain way, this is transmodal storytelling. This is talking about narrative modes and putting them together. There's a linear documentary, but there's also an interactive that helps to articulate different aspects of it, engages users in a new way. The algorithmic will fit into that space. So let's jump into that. So in this case, I think the key word with algorithms in this storytelling space is that they're used recursively. They're used to gather information from us and use that information to help shape the experience. It's not me shaping the experience, it's the algorithm reading me shaping the experience. And in a certain way, this combines those two earlier story forms I talked about. Shakespeare is a fixed text. I read it, I don't have to click anything, all I have to do is turn the page. Well, with an algorithmic story, it's the same thing. It's presented to me as already there, as fixed. I don't have to make choices. The choices have been made for me. But the choices made for me have been based on me, on some semblance, some notion, good or bad, of who I am. Authorship in this sense is deferred. It's not exactly clear. There's not a human agent doing it. There's a system. But who designed that system? What is that system privileging? Where is power in this relationship? Where is agency in this relationship? It's a very, very murky space, and we're just now kind of starting to tease out some of the elements that make this world click and work. And this is the space, I think, that it's so important for us as a documentary community to think hard about. Those people that use this, The Moment would be an example, or Riot would be an example. We'll see a couple of in the presentation. These are systems that test how these algorithms are working, that confront us with those workings. And by confronting us, it's not just the kind of thumb-sliding joy of whatever, Facebook or whatever. It actually sort of stops you and makes you think and makes you aware of the system. And in that awareness is the hope that we can recover some power and some agency. So we all know that already, this is old stuff, we know already that a lot of our cultural tastes are curated and contextualized by algorithms. This is EchoNest, the algorithm behind Spotify, and it used to be behind Pandora. It's kind of they do really well in the musical space, but this is the mechanics, the algorithmic mechanics that operate a ton of different systems. And they kind of, past is prologue. What we used to like is kind of what we get a lot more of with some variation. The context for our listening are kind of set by these algorithms. So this is stuff we know about. We know that Amazon does it, at least in my case, I'm so predictable, uncannily well. And we know that Facebook, in its own way, if we want to think of this as a narrative or not, is constantly tweaking the system. This is an engineering culture where if it's 82% this week, why can't we get it up to 83 next week? They'll chip away till they get it right. And so this kind of constant improvement, this constant inscription of the user, reading of the user, in order to lengthen stay per visit, leads to pretty depressing and pretty impressive ends. And if you want to know why, look at these numbers. Usually when you see these kind of charts, if you look at the date line, it's like off into 2050 or something. It's, the wishful thinking, pie in the sky. This is up until 2016. That line is still going. Incredible levels of investment in a couple of specific areas of AI: deep learning, natural language processing, computer vision, and image recognition. These three areas are the three main areas that are used for algorithmic storytelling. So it's very, this is really striking. Those of you in the VR world probably have sensed the oxygen now leaving the room in the investment climate in VR. It's not what it was a couple of years ago. And if you want to know where that money is going, my guess is a lot is going into this space. And this is the space that is behind the developments that we're going to just take a quick look at. Do any of you know this company, Epigogics? Epigogics started as a risk management company and realized that there's a lot of risk in financing of films, of feature films. So they spent a lot of time developing an algorithm that could basically take in a script, casting decisions, and comes out with 70% accuracy with a box office prediction. Hollywood hates this. Like, this does not go well with the mogul culture, but investors love it. And it's a pretty, I love the image too, I love the graphic. Quoting Aristotle and squeezing a brain between your fingers, it's... But all to say, this deployment of algorithms becomes a real shaper in what kind of culture gets made. In other words, you get a green light or a red light depending on what the algorithm says. And that's kind of new. And again, who's the algorithm? Who's authored it? What is it tweaked for? New York Times ran this story in 2015, but it was a provocation. It included a quiz. Would you know? And the truth is we don't know. Companies, text generator companies, algorithmic text generators like these companies, Narrative Science and Automated Insights, are selling millions, tens of millions of stories per year. This is a trend, this is a move that started around 2012, and it is really significant business today. So sports coverage, financial coverage, 3/4 of what you'll read on BuzzFeed is being authored by these tools. And they require minimal human intervention. They're pretty impressive. So in the world of print, this notion of personalization. This leads to some hyper-personalization. You can write stories of the same event for people that want to see it from multiple perspectives. Best case I can give is a Little League baseball team where stories are written for each of the parents depending on what position their kid played. Catcher, pitcher, outfielder. They get a personalized story, and it's trivial to do that. So this is, in the world of, let's say, fake news, this is what is fake and what isn't with these kinds of manipulations coming out. So what about our world? What about the moving image? I don't know if any of you are using Clip. Any Clip users? To read the rhetoric, this is a smart camera. It knows when to turn itself on and when to turn itself off and which clips to keep. I mean, okay, what the hell does that even mean? I don't know. I have a hard time fathoming it. But if you look at sports coverage, and if you look at the cameras that are, like about half the cameras in use are using this system. They follow the ball. They prefer medium and close shots if they can get them fast enough. So this space of automated image capture is growing quickly, and it's just hit the consumer market with Google Clip. Editing. The Adobe and Stanford, there's a good white paper on this online. This past year, they came up with this automated video editing system. You feed in the script, so it knows what the dialogue is. It's for word-based cutting. And then you kind of tell it what you prefer. Do you prefer to see the speaker when they speak? Do you prefer emotional coverage? Do you prefer news style or cinema verite style? And this thing will spit out an instant rough cut. And it's funny, I mean, if you want some depressing entertainment, go to Reddit and see what the editors are saying about this. And there is a panic. There's a real panic about this system. We know that we can generate sounds pretty much. We can make people say whatever we want them to say. We know we can make people's faces. We can turn people into meat puppets, and we can model that now on video. So we can generate the sound, and we can generate the imagery. We can generate the cut. So the ability to sort of construct and synthesize whatever it is we need to see those tools are out there. And they're all a little prototypey. They're all a little bumpy. But Moore's law reigns still, and still we can expect a doubling of processing capacity over the next 2 years. And as long as that's the case, put those investments next to Moore's law, and you've got the makings for something pretty profound. The Chinese are ahead of the world on this stuff. This is every teacher's either dream or nightmare. You can track your students. You can track 6 degrees of emotional response. Are they bored? Are they excited? Or do they hate you? I make no claim. There are a couple of factories now that are deploying. That are deploying these kinds of systems so they can tell if workers are getting restless or just about to strike. I'm not sure what they're really looking for. And it seems that, to be honest, the evidence here is pretty thin, as far as I've been able to find out. But because a lot of it's in Chinese, it's out of my range. Something like Notes on Blindness has one of the simplest and elegantly simple deployment of algorithms. If you are an active viewer, if you're spinning around, if you're exploring the world, the narration takes its good old time. And if you just kind of sit there, I tried it with my mom and she loved it, but she thought it was a movie and she sat perfectly still and the narrative accelerates. So that's a subtle but powerful use. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. In the VR world, we're headed the next step in VR, and it's in the labs, and I know some of you have worked with it, but it's working with eye trackers. So if you think, 360 was where we started and still are, and it's morphing, I would say it's getting more and more autonomy as its own medium, 360. VR is arguably, definitely an argument, but it's moving into more interactive spaces where we can actually change and manipulate things in the world. It might meet that notion of the experienced story that I talked about. But this third generation that's using eye trackers really enables navigation through the world because the system's watching where I look and motivating a scene change based on where I look. A character that I spend time looking at may lead the story in a direction that looking at another character may not. It also enables foveated rendering, which will make all of our lives simpler in terms of super high definition imagery. But with that comes a problem, and the problem is information. Facebook didn't invest in Oculus just to be nice and just because this was going to be the toy of the future. This is a data sucker of the future. Where you look and how your pupils dilate, what your heart rate is as read through your pupil, becomes really interesting information. It's not just the shoes, it's the gold shoes that make my eyes tingle. And that becomes really, that's the business model. It's not giving us a better experience, that comes along with it. So this is the kind of stuff that makers, it seems to me, while they're doing a social change thing, also need to present to us. How does the trick work? And I mean, I'm a real Vertovian in that sense. Show me how it works, and it'll help me both accept reality as more real, but it also enables me to be more critical of the medium. These are the things that are deployed more and more. This is an EEG reader inside a cap, and they're using these in factories in China, allegedly, to sort of track user behaviors. So they're using facial emotion trackers, and they're using EEG trackers. But these can also be used as drivers of narrative. Again, it's a data scraper, and what do we do with that data? We can sell it, or we can use it creatively. We can use it to have fun with someone, to use recursion as a way to generate insight, the promise of cybernetics in a certain way. And of course, these kind of trackers. A lot of different data sources at our disposal, a lot of different sensors out there that algorithms can translate into navigation systems for narratives. Affect trackers, or facial, not so much an identity recognition, but an emotional recognition is out there. Keep that little camera on your computer papered over, because this, how do you test ads these days? And you can really test them easily by just looking at affect as people watch. Karen Palmer did a project that really works on this, and it's not an unproblematic project, but it's an incredibly interesting one, where the user's facial responses shift how that narrative will go. Now, that raises all kinds of questions about race and culture, affect, and how we show it. Great, those are the questions we need to be raising and asking about. Okay, implications. So first, I want to just say, to emphasize again, I see all three of these story forms not as an evolution, not as from primitive to advanced. I think, as I tried to show, that the first two forms, the authored and the experienced, have co-inhabited the world more or less, well, certainly for the last couple thousand years. And they work together well, and that there's ample evidence here of linear docs that have, interactive counterparts to them. The algorithmic part introduces something new and something that's kind of easy to miss. It's easy to miss because it looks familiar. The product that we encounter, the fixed text, looks fairly familiar. It looks like an old school linear text, but it isn't. And so we got to think a little more critically about those. And just like Alice, going through the mirror, you enter a world that's familiar, but kind of a little bit uncanny. It's a reading of a world. In her case, it's a dark reading of her world. And we have to really start to think about what is the nature of that membrane that we're passing through or seeing ourselves through. So I'll just read this anyway. Sensors and algorithms are capable of shaping textual environments, determining which texts we see, creating texts and versions of texts, and interacting with perceived user preferences and behaviors. And it's that last bit. It's the perception of. All those little technologies I showed you are showing some part of me. But which part? They're reading some trace of me as significant. But which part? And isn't significant? And we know from the world of predictive policing, where people are basically stopped by the police because their behaviors, much like this, the algorithm has been triggered because it corresponds with something suspicious. What does that actually mean? And this recursiveness is really tricky because it is some version of me that's driving the story, but I really don't have any ability to change it. It's not like an experiential narrative that I can go left or right or I can stop it or whatever. In this case, it's reading me and it's seducing me by presenting myself to me, but I am unable to kind of grab the controls and change it. So this is a very, very insidious condition. Raising the question, who's watching this process? Like, who's behind these algorithms? How do we think about them? There's just now starting to be PhDs entering the world of people who've looked anthropologically or ethnographically at algorithm designers. What do they even think they're doing? Who are they working actually for? What kind of embedded sense of ethics inhabit that world, if any? Is this just about improving from 82% to 83%? Is there a bigger quest? Algorithm design very quickly becomes something like philosophy, and that's a very interesting space. I did symbolic logic at university, so it's a thing I really think about a lot. But I notice in conversations with colleagues who actually design the things, that's not what they're thinking. They're thinking about that next 1% of optimization. So we really need to spend a lot more time thinking about this as a cultural practice. This is not just any old tool. This is a tool with some very powerful attributes. And it raises to me the key cultural questions, and these are always the questions in documentary. Who has agency? Who has the ability to speak? Who has the ability to represent? That is always the question lurking in the projects we make. At MIT, in our lab, we're doing a lot of work now on co-creation, where we're committed to working with communities to think about the agenda together. I think it's crucial that professionals work with the people, the bums on the seat, the people that we're trying to speak to, in order to enhance understanding of how the bigger process works, in order to break down some of the distrust that's beginning to emerge in this space. It's not about us telling stories for people, because that still gives us all the power. It's about trying to distribute that and share that and empower the people that we're working with. Who has access? And access is another really key issue here, and it's kind of been falsely framed. A lot of times you hear the thing, well, if only Google would give us access to their algorithms. It's like, this is like asking for access to the bricks in the Empire State Building. Like, what would you do with them? It's literally hundreds of millions of algorithms assembled together, constantly changing, and because of personalization, impossible to really cross-coordinate and verify. It's, in a way, access to the algorithm is the wrong question, but access to the goals of those algorithms is the right question. What are they trying to achieve? What counts as optimization? Because only then can we assess, are they doing their job, or is it a job that should be done or not be done? But it's kind of a ruse, the other question, show me the algorithm, because really that's, even for a Google engineer, that's a ridiculous question. And ethics, of course. Ethics, to me, are a really fundamental issue of every technology we work with. There's a built-in ethical stance. It's easy to think about them as tools. It's easy to fetishize the tech and want the latest and whatever. But actually embedded, hardwired into every piece of technology we work with is a relationship, is a stance in the world. And with these recursive systems that prey on us, that feed on us, it really becomes important. Data is inherently partial, that's for sure. I think often a good example is LiDAR. If you're using a LiDAR-based VR system, you've got the old problem of the photograph was one, is it indexical or not indexical? Is it a print and proof of the world or not? And I think we more or less said it's not, at least in my circles. LiDAR raises a different question. You've got a zillion points of data, simple measurements between the object and the measuring surface. Seems pretty objective. But those data points are useless without an algorithm that brings them to life, that makes them dance. And what's the nature of that algorithm? What's that algorithm been coded to do? And that's where it's completely artful and completely capriciously, it could be anything. There is no right way or wrong way. The most you can do is mimic and emulate the real, but that's not hardwired into the algorithm. So these become very, very fraught spaces where we want to sort of think of it as data and real and solid, but actually it's not. I think how one looks at this stuff kind of boils down to worldview. Are you a Hobbesian or a Lockean? or in the terms of the debate that surfaced in today's New York Times, are you Zuckerberg or Musk? Zuckerberg, a very pro-AI proponent, and Elon Musk warning us that if we don't intervene now in AI, it's going to be too late. We're just about at the tipping point. And that Muskian, Hobbesian view is to me a powerful one, an important one. I mean, I like to be optimistic, and I think there's a ton we can do with these tools. But it takes that kind of very delicate dance between the cutting-edge technology world and the world of artists, and the cutting-edge technology world and the world of universities and researchers, and the cutting-edge research world of universities and makers. There's a little triangle there of industry, of artists, and of academics that could be a generative one. But the problem is how that industrial side is kind of unpredictable. I think academics and artists can work together pretty well. It happens, and this place is probably as good an example as any, it happens that industry and the artists can work together, but sometimes the terms are not terms of your choosing, and that becomes kind of tricky. So how this is going to play out, what we need to watch for, again, is largely worldview. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions, and thanks for putting up with this.
Hi, William, great talk. So Zuckerberg being the prime example, we know that the vast majority of these algorithms are being written by white males. And I'm wondering if you can give some examples of where that particular bias might impact the way an algorithm functions.
So I guess I would put the bias. So there is indeed there's a demographic profile that we can point to for at least a sector. I mean, I would actually say probably there are more Asian males than Caucasian males in this business right now. Primarily because China has been the biggest investor. I mean, they're really putting big bucks in it. When I lecture over there and see the scale of the scale of the audience is pretty daunting. So these are. There are like literally armies of people working on this stuff in Asia. So I'm not sure it's white male problem. What I think it is kind of a profession. It's about a professional mindset, and that professional mindset has a name, and it's engineering. Engineering is an Enlightenment project. I mean, there were certainly engineering projects before that, but engineering as we know it grows right out of that three-point perspective image I showed you. That starts a kind of very elaborate discourse of how the world works, how we see, how things connect, and that things are always tweakable and improvable and betterable. And it's about efficiencies and it's about optimization. And those become drivers irrespective, like culture is peripheral to those drivers. So I think that the folks who work on SEO would be great examples of that. They just want to optimize ever more rigorously and better, but they don't look left or right. It's not about like cultural implications or whatever. So I think, to me, yeah, you could look at this as a demographic problem, and it is. But when I look at like my black students, for example, black female students who are engineers at MIT, they buy into the same rhetoric. In fact, probably they survive in that space because they accept that rhetoric of let's make it better. I think it's the arts world. It's people that kind of have the skill sets but work in the arts who are not really working for optimization. They're working for something else, expressivity or change or provocation or outright hacking. So those, I think it's about that, the deformation here is professionalism more than anything else, more than race or gender. Although those are obviously hardwired into the long term. That's why we're where we are, that's for sure.
Hi, that was fantastic, William. And actually, the last thing you said about the mindset that creates, that's driving this technology, I think is fascinating. And the gap between the engineering mindset and the greater optimization and the cultural one. Because I think the philosophical question, I think, at the heart of your talk is what is story? Like, what is story for? And I suppose one of the thoughts I had thinking about this, about moving towards personalization and the idea that the only way we connect with a story is if it mirrors our own worldview. I'm wondering what you think about that, because I think the thing around the authored story, what's fascinating about that is that you completely get someone's whole view that isn't yours. And I think that's the beauty of stories, the fact that you get to see somebody else's perspective that isn't yours. And that my fear is there's the algorithmic move is that it's creating greater polarity in the fact that we can only have stories unless they're like us. So I just wonder what you think about that.
I agree fully. It's a great danger. That recursiveness is the problem. It's a mirror, and it's a deformed one at that. So, okay, it can be satisfying in the way that Facebook is kind of satisfying or not. It may boil down to personality types. There are those who want their worldviews reaffirmed and those who want to sort of try the new and dangerous. But I agree totally. To me, story is a vehicle that enables me to sort of experience things in a without getting killed, but to try to put try on other people's shoes and see how the world fits that way. So it's one reason I think there's no fear of us losing the authored story. That sense of being able to inhabit someone's own bubble is I think going to be always with a segment of the population. But if I look at the reading habits of younger people today, and just the decline in, at least statistics, and to whatever extent they're accurate, there seems to be quite a decline in readership of other texts, but while they're still very active reading, in the sense of reading a lot of social media. And those are such aggregations of self in a way that it's alarming. It is alarming.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting for me as a filmmaker to see where different realms that stories can inhabit these days and where we're moving to. But I wonder, what do you see happening in terms of the actual story structure, the actual mechanics of the story? I mean, thinking of John Woods and John York, Into the Woods, how stories works and why we tell them. He says that he argues that we are genetically programmed to perceive stories in a 3-act or 5-act type of, build-up, crisis resolution type of structure. I wonder where do you see this going? That would be really helpful, for me to think of my stories as a filmmaker going forward.
Sure. So I see that kind of an argument as basically someone who's arguing for experiential story through the authored story. The authored story has a very highly developed body of theory behind it, going back to Aristotle, in fact. So that notion of a very particular kind of structure, a notion of always a teller, there's a bunch of ingredients that pretty much every narrative theorist agrees with, and those have been hardwired in our educational system, K through postgraduate, for a couple hundred years, and embedded in our culture from Aristotle on. So when people start to, when game people, for example, will start to talk about, hey, there's clearly some narrative action going on in a game that you experience, even though you haven't a clue what the outcome will be, and there are many possible outcomes. So wait a minute, there's no teller there unless it's yourself. And it's not a past tense, which stories kind of have to be. So how does that work? In general, they're going to look back onto that well-known domain of literary theory to try to make their case for this experiential storytelling. But I would agree with the kind of radical phrasing of what you said, which is, this is hardwired in us. It's how we connect the dots. 3-act or 5-act, I'm not convinced. I think there are stories that just change, like micro. In fact, if you were to look at narrative another way, look at a page turner. Take like Harry Potter, or something that people can't stop changing the pages. In fact, it's a series of micro-narratives. Little micro-narratives that get you to turn the page. It's not waiting for, you don't read the story arc or the first third of the book to see what's going to the plot point. It's piece by piece, paragraph by paragraph. They're really instructional to look at. And I think that's how a hunter works. It's like, another track. Oh, a bit of fur. It's like these little micro narratives that actually in the aggregate turn into a chain experience. So I would argue, it's useful to not discard 3-act and 5-act, but actually to step back and look at the actual micro workings. Every good editor knows, Like what they're in fact doing is building micro narratives. Because why am I gonna, I can kind of guess where this story's going, so what's gonna keep me in my seat? And it's those little surprises that each conversation unfolds on, each reveal in a shot shows me. I would focus on the micro narrative, and that's common to all these structures. Oh, green light.
Fantastic, really enjoyed it, and I think you're doing amazing work at MIT. I've been doing for a while. Could you give me any insight into the current thinking about developments in neuroscience and understanding the brain and how they interface with the development of effective algorithms?
Yeah, so there are a couple of fronts here, and they're troublesome in a way. So in the world of VR, for example, Jeremy Bailenson has a new book out from Stanford that kind of goes through a lot of claims on neuropsychology and VR. And the crux, there are a lot of ways to talk about this. One way to talk about it that they've argued is that we are all familiar with representation. Photography is representation, video is representation, film is representation. That fires off, and they do these MRI scans, and it seems to activate one part of the brain. VR, it seems, fires off in another part of the brain that's associated with experience. Now, is that true? Let's start with, is it true? If any of you have had any MRI done, where you're on like this table and it goes in a massive metal donut and it makes noise from hell, A, you know that like it's brain rattling, even with like sound canceling headsets on, it's mind numbing. B, you know it's kind of hard to move around, and in VR you need to. Is what's being measured motor response? Like I don't know, I think these are, put some salt on these experiments, but if, let's say they're accurate, and that's what the neuropsychologist I talked to says they're accurate, and why he's doing this work is he's actually trying to actively recircuit experience, recircuit brain structure. So this is a guy who started his career as a peace and reconciliation counselor, grew frustrated with the failure rate there, and thought, damn it, I'm gonna go in the brain and like rewire it. So just like it's very hard for you to put your finger in a flame, even if you wanted to, it's hard. He thinks he can like get us to, some of our sociopathic behaviors can be like rewired out so that we don't. There's tons of work there, and there's a lot of money. And my concern is always like when you find any claim that you can alter someone's behavior through a tool, the big money is not on our side. The big money is where you don't want it to be. So like I hope for our sake it doesn't work, A, and B, if it does work, it's our jobs to really grab it fast and confront it, show how this stuff is supposed to work. So with a lot of these EEG systems, for example, that are supposed to be able to track you, you can throw them off really. They're both easy, they're easy to beat, and they're easy to it's easy to throw a lot of noise in it too. Just clenching your teeth or something like that can throw it off. And if you want to hit the mark, I did this with Casper at the Doc Lab a couple years ago. They had a display where if you thought about something, the right thought, in my case, lust, this balloon would blow up. But as it got bigger and bigger, you knew it was going to blow in your face, and you would lose concentration. And yeah, it's easy to sort of, they're easy to hack, but I don't know. Could you mention the author's name again? Bailenson, B-A-I-L-E-N-S-O-N. Oops, I'm on the caution light here, so I'm not, the yellow light means the hook is coming. There's a question there, if there's time for it. This one, oh.
I'd like to challenge you on the answer you had to the woman about Harry Potter, because it feels like if the engineers are creating these algorithms, it's like the inmates are running the asylum, because you have the idea of if we're only reacting to stories at a minute level, I think we're sophisticated enough to be looking for a meta level of storytelling. So you read Harry Potter, and yes, it's a page turner because it's so well crafted in the moment, but everybody is looking for the aha, the experience of the meaning of the story, the purpose of the story. The tracker in the woods is looking for the ultimate meaning of the pleasure of getting the game or being in the wild or once again learning more about nature. We're working on multiple levels of storytelling, and what I don't see happening is an appreciation for the actual metaphysical level of the art of storytelling, which is the aha surprise moment. You're led into a whole new reality of thought and experience and awareness as a human being. And that, I think, is the real concern. You know, if we're looking at the siloed environment of the US election in 2016 and Facebook driving that, and they're just fueling with their algorithms how people are reacting to the same material, it's creating a firestorm of reactivity and silo behavior. So how do we argue to bring in the idea of the aha, the surprise, the ultimate awareness of why we love story?
Well, let's say personally, I agree with you, and I wish everyone agreed with you, but it seems there's a wonderful Siegfried Krakauer article on bestsellers and their readers back from the 20s, late 20s in Berlin, where he laments something I think we could lament today, and it's just look at the literature that really does sell. Alas, I think that metaphysical content is kind of scarce. These are page turners that, I mean, I don't want to make a classist or taste distinction here, but I would say that like what constitutes grand literature and stuff that's really been demonstrated over the long haul to be pretty profound is not being read at rates that other kinds of stuff is, that it's page turner and fodder. So I think there's an audience for this, and I wish it were a bigger audience, and maybe a question is how to make it a bigger audience. When you said well-crafted, that's the part I'm looking at. What's the well-crafting part of any page turner? And I think that's the micro-narrative. That's actually the mechanism that gets you to, the question you leave this page with that must be answered on the next page is what gets you to turn it. So that's well-crafted. It's not like it's not a trick. It's a piece of craft. I agree with you. That's the metaphysical content of a great novel or a great piece of work, great work of art is always the thing it's about, which is why I think it behooves us to do this kind of work and to do it in a way that reflects on the technology rather than to just cede it to Facebook, where people seem capable of spending hours zipping through these images and making connections of a kind, possibly even a narrative connection of a kind, but I would argue without very much metaphysical bang for the buck. So I'm with you on that, but it's why the arts need to be the place. Why the arts need to be the place that explores these new tools, rather than waiting for them to be packaged off and given to us as a Google clip.
I'm glad you made that distinction. You talked about engineers rather than scientists. I was so relieved. I have a background in research science myself. I've worked a lot with ethnographers making narrative stories as documentaries about other people's lives in very different scenarios to my own background. But at the moment I'm going back to my roots. I'm really interested in this discovery, this aha, which is not necessarily conceptually the same as giving people a narrative which they can write themselves or be written depending on their responses. It's a discovery. I mean, one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is about single-celled microorganisms and how they respond to the tides. I want people to be able to go into a space that they can't physically go into with their own body, but cameras and audio recorders can, microscopes can, and understand something more about how the world works. Now, that's not the same as a literary narrative. I'm just interested to know how many other people in this room, or you yourself, whether you're interested in that sort of documentary making, or what VR can offer that sort of world.
So I got the axe mark, so I have to be really quick, but I would say yes, I for one am absolutely interested in that space. It doesn't, for me, have to be story. It does have to be insight, and I think that's where we can use the recursiveness of this latest set of very powerful, potentially very dangerous tools. We can use that recursiveness for an aha moment by showing how they work with us, by showing us through that distorted mirror. That kind of recursion can also yield an aha that makes us look more critically. Heidegger's the man on tools, he talks about that in a great and powerful way. Thanks very much.